Sholem Aleichem, Tire Freund. A schönen Dank von Kommen zu unser Programm Shakespeare auf Yiddish. This is Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle, and I am thrilled to welcome everyone to tonight's program, Yiddish Shakespeare, an exploration of over a century of Vilyam Shekspir in our Mamalotion. For 125 years, the Workers' Circle, der Arbeiterring, has been championing our vibrant Yiddish culture. Our Yiddishkeit isn't just our heritage, it's a life force that inspires everything we do. From our Yiddish language program that each year teaches thousands of students worldwide to our social justice activist community of over 160,000 people who are right now fighting the rise of fascism and demanding democracy for all in the United States. All of us at the Workers' Circle are also proud to be the home of YiddishSongs.org, the Yossel and Chana Mlatek Yiddish Song Collection, where you can freely explore and download hundreds of Yiddish song music. As we celebrate the Arbeitering's 125th birthday, we have some amazing surprises in store in the coming months, including a Yiddish song marathon and the launching of our digital archives featuring over 50 years of The Call, the historic Workers' Circle magazine that traces the Eastern European immigrant experience of the 20th century. But tonight we're here for Shakespeare, the Bard of Yiddish. This is your Bubby and Zadie's Shakespeare, especially if they immigrated to New York at the turn of the 20th century. At the Arbeitering, we often proclaim everything sounds better in Yiddish. Tonight, we'll discover if that applies to Hamlet, Othello, and Romeo and Juliet. Our presenter, Professor Joel Berkowitz, will begin with an overview of Shakespeare and Yiddish theater before introducing members of the Yiddish Shakespeare Project. I encourage all of you to put questions in the chat or Q&A, and at the end of the program, we're going to answer as many of your questions as we can. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Joel Berkowitz, Professor of English and Director of the Sam and Helen Stahl Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. A theater historian and translator, he has published 4 books on Yiddish theater and drama, including Shakespeare on the American Yiddish Stage. Joel co-founded and directs the digital Yiddish Theater Project and consults for professional productions, including the Broadway and Milwaukee stagings of Paula Vogel's Indecent. And last but not least, in his early career days, Joel served as the Assistant Director of the Center for Jewish Cultural Life at the Workers' Circle. So this is coming home. Joel, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
And Ashenim Dank, it's really a pleasure to be here. It is a kind of coming home. Obviously, it's a subject dear to my heart, and working with the Arbeitering tonight brings back memories of. In fact, I did a few things with the Arbeitering. I taught in near Jenny's neck of the woods, the Westchester, White Plains, New York Shula in the early 1990s. I taught a little bit of Yiddish Sprach in the Manhattan headquarters. As Ann said, I worked on culture and education under truly the best boss I've ever worked for, Chava Lappin, just an amazing human being. And I had many fond memories of my time at Workman's Circle, even though it wasn't very long. A little while back, I noticed that some young kulturtours in New York were performing scenes from Shakespeare in Yiddish, which piqued my interest since my first major scholarly undertaking, and already referred to, we could bring up the first slide, was the focus of my 2003 book, Shakespeare on the American Yiddish Stage. My research led me to the conclusion that that activity had gotten started in earnest in the early 1890s, thrived for the next couple of decades, and then tended to trail off for reasons we can touch on in the Q&A if people want to. Certainly, Shakespeare would continue to make his presence felt in Yiddish in subsequent decades, but at least in the US in particular, in less concentrated form. And I'll talk a lot about US, but also a little bit about Shakespeare's presence elsewhere in Yiddish culture. But culture tends to develop in unpredictable ways, not linear, and I would say not even circular, but often in twisted or broken lines. And here we are in 2025 with young theater artists finding their way to both Yiddish and Shakespeare and making it their own. Tonight, we're going to talk about that with Hunter McIlvaine, Jenny Reich-Litzky, and Jake Levy from the creative team of the Yiddish Shakespeare Project, which is comprised of Hunter College theater students and alumni who share a passion for the Yiddish language. First, though, I'm going to provide some context for the discussion. So let's go back a little bit, and we can look at the next slide. And actually, quite quickly, the one after that. These are from the wonderful Barbara Kirschenblatt, Gimlet's late father, Meir Kirschenblatt. So his lovely folk paintings of Purimspiel and of the Badchen. So those are the point I want to make with these slides is that although many of us may think of Yiddish theater as a modern phenomenon and professionally, it doesn't start until the late 19th century. Yiddish performances of various kinds go back into the Middle Ages. And scholars have traced lines from things like the Badchen, the entertainer at weddings, and certainly the Purimspiel, which were often improvised plays, but sometimes fully scripted, sometimes very short, sometimes longer, that were performed back into medieval and early modern times. The Haskalah or Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, starting in the late 18th century, gives us the first, what we might think of arguably as the first modern Yiddish plays. And we could look at the next slide. A play like Molière's Tartuffe, the great classic comedy, was adapted into Yiddish, into a very westernized or Germanized Yiddish, because this was the Berlin Haskalah, Aaron Hallen-Wolfson, who adapts this tale of a hypocritical sort of religious figure into a play called Leichtsinn und Fremelei. It's not a translation of Tartuffe. It's taking the sort of broad outlines of the script and making it very Jewish and speaking very much to the moment that was in, which was the 1790s. And the next slide, this is a play that my friend and colleague Jeremy Dauber and I, Jeremy's at Columbia, translated in our collection, Landmark Yiddish Plays. So if you want to check out Leichtsinn und Fremelei, what we call Silliness and Sanctimony in English, you can look there. But the phenomenon of explicitly adapting or translating works from the Western canon into Yiddish wouldn't really take off in earnest until the professional Yiddish theater got off the ground, starting in the 1870s. So I'm going to give a really brief sketch of that. This starts with, in the next slide, Avram Goldfaden, who I'm sure is a name that many of you know, assembling a small troupe in Iași, Romania in 1876. Goldfaden had actually already published some plays and had published some poetry, and he was kind of a jack of all trades, and he tried a lot of different things, but he puts a company together, he starts writing material for them, has some success, and goes on the road around Romania and parts of the Russian Empire. And what's interesting, besides the phenomenon of Goldfaden himself, is that pretty quickly his troupe attracts competition. So there are a couple of rival troupes who are now doing their own things with Yiddish drama and theater and creating more repertoire and competing with one another. When after the Tsar is assassinated in 1881, sparking a huge wave of emigration to other parts of the world, Yiddish theater, Yiddish culture and theater and language migrate with it, and Yiddish speakers move into Western Europe and the Americas and other parts of the world. And so we're going to go west right to America and look at the rise of the American Yiddish theater, which will sort of set the stage for Shakespeare. So in the early 1880s, new hubs of Yiddish theater activity begin developing in Polish towns and cities, areas in Western Europe like London's East End, and the US, with, of course, New York emerging, at least for a while, as the world capital of Yiddish theater. It would stay one of the world capitals. We'll talk about that a little more in a moment. Much of the early repertoire consists of comedies, melodramas, or light operas by the likes of Goldfaden and his main early rivals, Moshe Horowitz and Joseph Latiner. Shakespeare's name starts to figure prominently in the repertoire in the early 1890s, with an explosion of adaptations and translations that would last for the next couple of decades. So why then, and why Shakespeare? For one thing, he was just one more source of content. They were hungry for content. There are a handful of playwrights working at this point in Yiddish, and they just can't keep up. This is also not a culture yet, whether in Yiddish or elsewhere, of really long runs. So you always needed to be offering something new. But of course, Shakespeare wasn't just any source of content. The rapid expansion of the Yiddish stage was happening in an Anglophone country where if a family owned two books, then the second one, of course, the first being the Bible, the second one was Shakespeare. 19th century Americans were very well versed in Shakespeare, and that's affecting the overall cultural environment that these Jewish immigrants who are in places like the Lower East Side and elsewhere are very aware of that. There was also, of course, throughout the Western world, no playwright more prominent in the repertoire or more likely to have written many of the roles in comedy and tragedy for women and for men that would help define an actor's place in the profession. And it wasn't just actors who were interested in proving their mettle with Shakespeare. There's a long global multilingual tradition of translating Shakespeare and adapting Shakespeare into other languages. This was taken very seriously early on by German translators and playwrights who really sort of elevate Shakespeare to a very high level. Russian intellectuals and some of these Yiddish playwrights and critics were among them, also turned to Shakespeare. And so there's Shakespeare sort of coming at Yiddish culture from a number of different directions. And let's go to the next slide. And one of those Russian intellectuals was a man named Jacob Gordon, who had already been active in Russian letters by the time he reached New York in 1891. He claimed to be skeptical about the prospects of Yiddish theater at first, but in the next slide, we'll see a picture of Jacob Adler, who Gordon meets soon after coming to America. He's very impressed with Adler, also Russian-born, present-day Ukraine and from Odessa. And he feels that with someone like Adler and some of the other people he's meeting, he can really do something. So he champions naturalistic social dramas and starts writing plays in that vein that tackle social issues like economic inequality, hypocrisy, and corruption on the part of the rich and powerful. Fortunately, that's not a problem anymore, and the status and treatment of women at home and at work. One of his first plays, which premiered in 1892, was Der Yiddische König Lear, the Jewish King Lear, and we see that on the next slide. Before we know anything else about that play, we see that the play's very title foregrounds the connection to Shakespeare. Gordon layered the Lear story onto that of an Eastern European Jewish family. As in King Lear, when the patriarch gathers his grown daughters and their partners at the start of the play to divide up his estate, the two elder daughters flatter him while his youngest daughter is far more honest. The father angrily casts her out, setting off the chain of events that will propel us toward the play's melodramatic conclusion, a very different conclusion from Shakespeare's. The Yiddish König Lear was a significant critical success, seen as a work that helped elevate the artistic level of the Yiddish repertoire. Gordon would return to the Lear story 6 years later to create one of his best-known and best-loved works, Mirele Ephris, or the Jewish Queen Lear. And the next slide shows Kenny Liptzin, one of the great leading ladies of her day, and Gordon writes this part for her. And it immediately becomes one of the towering roles on the Yiddish stage for a woman of a certain age and a certain degree of gravitas, such as Ida Kaminska. In fact, her mother, Esther Rochel Kaminska, before her, and we see a poster for Ida Kaminska's production of Mirele Ephris on the next slide. And going to the next one, we see the great Russian, in this case, present-day Belarus-born actress Hanna Rovina, who becomes one of the great stars of the Israeli stage, leading lady for Habima, who also plays Mirele Ephris. On the next slide, we see the cover of Nama Sandro's wonderful recent anthology, which contains an excellent English translation. So I refer you to that if you want to read the play. And on the next slide, we see an advertisement for the film version, which I'm sure some of you have seen, and you can find out there, the 1939 version of Mir Efres. I love this this ad that says it's a great play, an even better film, and it's actually quite a good film. And Gersten's performance is marvelous. Gordon's initial adaptation inspired imitators, ultimately giving such works as his protege Leon Koben's Der blinde Musikant oder der Jiddische Othello, Nochem Rakov's Der Yeshiva-Bocher oder the Yiddish Romeo und Julia, and Boris Tomaszewski's musical adaptation of The Taming of the Shrew. I saw someone mention that nearly 4 decades before Kiss Me Kate, Die Schöne Amerikanerin from 1910. Gordon also helped spark the wave of Yiddish translations we see in the 1890s and early 1900s. Some of the plays that mentioned in the chat are there. Macbeth, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, all popular on American English language stages at the time, get translated into Yiddish. But 5 plays emerge as the big 5 that in terms of what was being produced in Yiddish. And you've already heard maybe all or most of them: Lear, Hamlet, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, and the perhaps obvious but also problematic work featuring Shakespeare's only explicitly Jewish characters, The Merchant of Venice. And we see a picture of that on the next slide. Actually, sorry, I passed over. That's Bertha Kalish, posing in a way that looked very much like advertisements for the great French Jewish-born actress Sarah Bernhardt, who had played Hamlet before in French. Bertha Kalish plays Hamlet and tours with her in 1901. And we go on to the next slide, and we see Jacob Adler, very interestingly, playing Shylock fully in Yiddish in 1901, then in 1903, and again in 1905, performed Shylock on Broadway with Adler performing in Yiddish and the rest of the company performing in English. That may sound very strange to us, but those sorts of things were not uncommon in that era, where people would bring over, the great Italian tragedian or a German tragedian or something, and have these sort of multilingual performances. And of course, if in a very familiar play, if you know Othello really well, as many audiences would know then, that if you see Tommaso Salvini playing Othello in Italian and everyone else is performing in English, from the context and the place in the play, you can follow pretty well. You don't necessarily need to know Italian. Let's turn to Europe for a second. As the European Yiddish theater continued to develop, it added Shakespearean interpretations of its own. Shakespeare would never figure in the Yiddish repertoire there to the degree that he did at a certain point in the US, I think partly because of all kinds of factors that by the time that the places like Warsaw and Moscow are emerging as major centers, you have a cadre of Yiddish playwrights with Peretz and Pinsky and Hirschbein and on, who are developing their own homegrown repertoire and don't feel the need, I think, to sort of import things to as great an extent. And I'm generalizing a bit. But there were also, there were other factors too. I'll point to a couple of productions from the 1930s that stand out among European Yiddish contributions. One, we can see the part of the program on this slide, the poet and playwright Alan Saitlin's translation of The Tempest, staged in 1938 with the great Avram Morevsky as Prospero. And on the next slide, we see Morevsky, familiar, I'm sure, to many of you, as the Rabbi Azriel in the Dybbuk, in the 1937 film version, among his many, many important roles. And the Moscow State Yiddish Theater, Gosset's 1935 production of King Lear, König Lear, starring its leader, Shlomo Mechoils, on the next slide. In a performance that was praised not just from Yiddish speakers and not even just from Muscovites, but also from others who came from far and wide to experience Mechoils's and his fellow cast members' performances. If you go to YouTube and look up Mechoils Lear, I haven't checked just now, but certainly as of recently, you can actually find a sort of clip reel of some moments from that, amazingly enough, from the 1930s. So a couple of sort of final-ish points for now about the backstory of Shakespeare in Yiddish, and then we'll open this up to a discussion. I've mentioned a few places you can turn for further reading, all of them in English. It's worth noting that there's a body of published Yiddish versions, excuse me, of Shakespeare's plays and poetry. We see a few illustrations on the next slide that are pictured here. So we see some of the plays. We also see a couple of different translations of the sonnets into Yiddish. If you go to, and on the next slide, we see a screenshot from I think if you put in Shakespeare or Shakespeare transliterated, and certainly Shakespeare, if you put that there in English in the search box, you can find a number of digitized versions of original the Shakespeare translations and adaptations that the Yiddish Book Center has that has made available digitally, which is an incredible resource. I'll hasten to add, it's not all of the possible versions, and that's not a slight to the Yiddish Book Center. It just takes time to get to all of these, but we can actually access those with a couple of clicks of a mouse. So a final thought before I bring in our young theatrical mention. The last time I spoke publicly about Shakespeare in Yiddish was for a panel hosted a few years ago by the Yiddish cultural organization Kadima, based in Melbourne, Australia. And I ended my remarks then with the following thoughts. So what's next for Shakespeare in Yiddish? Every culture turns to Shakespeare, and by extension, any other playwright whose work spans ages, language, and cultures in ways that speak to it. Which plays by any playwright will Yiddish translators and artists find most compelling as we move into the 2020s? And what will they do with them? Translations, adaptations, full productions, excerpts, mashups, video treatments inspired by anything from K-pop videos to Hamilton to Zoom meetings. The sky is the limit. You can tell that was delivered during the height of the COVID epidemic. So those were my comments then. And I said also at the time that theater historians do not have crystal balls and we can't necessarily see what's coming. I didn't know these three young people, these theater people then, and even if I had, I'm not sure that Shakespeare in Yiddish was a twinkle in their eyes 5 years ago, but here we are. So let's talk about how their work fits into and continues the story of Yiddish Shakespeare. So I'll introduce them briefly and we'll turn to them here a little bit more, and then we'll talk about their work. So in addition to being a co-founder of the Yiddish Shakespeare Project and a teaching assistant at YIVO, Jake Levy is an actor, writer, stand-up comedian, and Yiddishist. Jenny Reichlitsky is an actor, director, and producer. She's a co-creator of the Yiddish Shakespeare Project and is to see this passion project grow. And Hunter McIlvaine recently graduated as a theater major with an arts management certificate and served as technician and producer for the Yiddish Shakespeare Project's recent series of sold out shows. So I'd love to turn to all three of you, maybe starting with Jenny, kind of randomly. Jenny, how did you come to Yiddish and Shakespeare, or both or either? Tell us a little bit about your journey to that, and then I want to hear from Hunter and Jake the same question.
Well, I think I have always had a connection to theater and Judaism, and people have always asked me how I was going to combine them, and I never knew if I would. But I majored in Jewish studies and in theater in college. But actually, Hunter, Jake, and I all worked on a project together about the Holocaust. It was a theater play. And it was not the best experience. We didn't really feel like the Jewish culture was being respected. So the three of us kind of got together and thought, why don't we create a more meaningful type of Jewish theater? And it's kind of where it started.
Thank you. Hunter, you want to add to that? What are your memories of getting into Shakespeare in Yiddish?
Yeah, I mean, I do remember this like Holocaust play, and then like I guess one day Jake was like came up to us and was like, "Oh, I'm thinking of doing Shakespeare in Yiddish," and we did kind of like that first bit of the scene, "Get Thee to Nunnery," and then kind of like grew from there. But yeah, I just like making theater with my friends.
And Jake, how about you? What comes to mind when you think about the sort of genesis of this project?
Well, I've been doing Shakespeare since I was very young. And once I started to get a grasp on the Yiddish language, I thought, this is a very interesting avenue. This is a very interesting type of Yiddish theater that can come about here. And I came to them with like this idea for the Hamlet scene, but I didn't know how it would get bigger this way.
Okay. So Jake, I'll stay with that for a second. When you're thinking of doing Yiddish theater, are you thinking Shakespeare from the beginning? Are you thinking about different possibilities? What kind of discussions were you having?
Well, there's a lot of really good indie Yiddish theater. There's a lot of good Yiddish theater Baclal. In New York City these days, there's a lot of good folks being stuff. There's a lot of good Glick shows. There's a lot of good stuff coming out of New Yiddish Rep, or from Michael Yashinsky. Um, and I think that when I started thinking about it, I thought, Shakespeare would be a really easy way to bring English speaking actors into this Yiddish world. I thought that Shakespeare would be an easy way. You have all the translations and they've been translated over, in some cases, very, very faithfully by these Soviet translators, and it would be easy to work with as a text, was some of the things that I was thinking about in the beginning.
Okay, thank you. And so where do you go from there? Maybe Jenny, I'll come back to you, in terms of how does it sort of then develop? What kind of discussions you're having about how you select material? Once you're doing Shakespeare, what Shakespeare are you doing and how, what, what kind of process do you have for that, for
Yeah,
doing that?
so when we first started 2 summers ago, we went into a black box theater in Hunter where we all went, and we just had the Get Thee to a Nunnery Hamlet scene translated and transliterated into English. And we kind of workshopped it for a few weeks, and then we kind of realized, well, we don't really have a deadline on this. We should probably kind of film this and put it somewhere. So we just filmed it on an iPhone and put it on YouTube. And then from there, we thought, like, we want to continue doing this. What are our next steps? And we learned so much from that first process, even though it was just one scene, that we kind of had more of an idea of what we want. So we extended the Hamlet scene to add more characters. We added the moment before with the king and the queen and RNG, and then the Ophelia monologue after. We had it filmed in like a more professional way and edited, and we added captions in English to make it more accessible to the audience. And then this year, for our Shakespeare in Yiddish live performance, we kind of wanted to start conquering live performances, which was definitely, such a different medium than film. And we decided to add 2 more types of plays, Romeo and Juliet and King Lear, and keep some Hamlet. And yeah, that's kind of the foundation of it.
Mhm. And so when you say we, maybe Hunter, I'll turn to you again. Who else is part of this we, and how are you finding people, or how are they finding you? How do people come to this?
Yeah, so I mean, like, the we is kind of like us three, like, kind of like starting things, and then I guess, like, for our actors and production crew, we mostly found them through like Instagram, just like reaching out, or like mutual like friends that we know. Like, we all studied theater in some aspect, so we kind of know people from that. I know Jenny was in a play with one of the other actors, so like she brought her in, and kind of just like that.
Hmm. And so I'm just sort of like casting half an eye on the chat and curious to see what people are asking, and we'll come to more of those questions later, I hope. We certainly will. But one, at least one person has asked something relative to what I'm interested in asking you about is, talk about the language, and all kinds of aspects of it. So how are you finding people? Are you finding people who are Yiddish speakers? If so, are they native speakers? Are they going to Abetering and Yivo? Are they learning things phonetically? Jake, you want to speak to the sort of, the challenge of finding people who have the linguistic chops, or can develop them so that they can do this credibly?
Right, yeah. So that was one of the big challenges of doing this project, because not everyone can just, pick up Yiddish and start being able to do it. It takes a lot of work and a lot of different, predisposition to certain things. We had people coming in who were German speakers. We had people coming in we had one actress who was an opera singer who was just very good at getting the phonetics right. We had people coming in who were, Israeli modern Hebrew speakers. Unfortunately, no Dafka Yiddish speakers. That was something that we were trying to conquer, but we have people definitely who are taking classes, definitely people who are trying to bust up those chops, and we were able to do it through a combination of transliteration and learning the phonetics of what was going on. This was easier for some people than others, but yeah, it's a lot of people's hard work at learning the phonetics and being able to parrot back the lines.
Right. And I've got to ask this. This question often comes up when people talk about Yiddish theater in any period. When you say phonetics, what are you doing about dialects? Are you basically staying with one? Are you playing around with them? Are there arguments about? Please tell me there are arguments, because I mean, if how could it be Yiddish theater without arguments, right?
So one of my biggest regrets on this project is that we did not go with the Berliner dialect for everything. I just think it's so much more of a richer dialect. It's got that theatrical history with it, and I like the e's over the oo's and the oo's over the ahs. We most of what we did ended up being put into Klausprach or into like a theater Luschen Klausprach kind of situation, just so that it would be easier for people who, wanted to go act by Volksbühne, wanted to go act wanted to be able to take Abderrang classes and YIVO classes and have a mutually intelligible thing going on. We did have one scene where the icker of the scene was basically between Romeo as this Litvak who's almost speaking Sabbatstickerlassen, and then Juliet as this Husid who's talking in a thick Hungarian Galicianish type accent.
Mhm.
And that was a major challenge for us, is to be able to give those accents over to these actors, especially who don't speak Yiddish. But yeah, the dialects, it's a big part of it.
Right. Right. And that just a comment about that. I mean, as I'm sure you know this, but and some in the audience will, I'm sure, be familiar, is that of course, Yiddish playwrights and other, writers in other forms too. And you open a Sholem Aleichem story or novel or those sorts of things. Those are coming up all of the time, right? Those differences and often associated with you think about the classic Peret story, Oid Nishtal Checha, right, with the sort of stereotype of the Litvak and the Galiciana and those sorts of things. So that's very much there in the culture and kind of ripe for the picking. But you also, Jake, you touch on a really important point, is that obviously when you guys, or anyone for that matter, is doing this material now, they're working in a very, very different environment, linguistic environment, cultural environment, what the audience can expect, all of that, than people who are doing this, any of the folks in any of the slides that I'm showing, whether we're talking from, the 1870s to the 1930s or whatever it might be. And so let's talk about that a little bit more in terms of audiences. Um, what I guess first of all, are there conversations that come to mind, like as you're planning this, about, like, first of all, how to also, you've got to find your actors, but finding an audience too, right? How do you reach people? Actually, so I'll start with that question, and I have more audience questions. But Hunter, you want to speak to that at all? Just any discussions about, like, okay, who's going to actually come to see us do this?
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like we've been lucky enough to have like kind of an already audience prepared, because we did shows at Hunter, Under St. Mark's, and the Idea Kitchen, both all of which have like people who go to see like whatever's happening there. I know Hunter was kind of easier to advertise because that was free because we got funding from Hunter College. And then like Under St. Mark's, I feel like is like a pretty like well-known kind of theater, so they have like an audience that already like goes to see their shows and like goes to just see whatever's going on no matter what. And like I think something that also like helped was that like I mean, we do have a lot of like Yiddish speakers coming to these, like, I mean, like in the grand scheme of things, but also we advertise the fact that like we have English super titles, so I think that makes it more accessible overall. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Jenny or Jake, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it was definitely a lot of conversation, because also as Hunter students who were doing a lot of shows at Hunter, which were free, this was kind of like, okay, if we're going to be selling tickets to this show, like, like who's going to come, who's going to buy these tickets. And it's like, this is not just, you know, our family and friends coming to this. This is actually something very relevant that might be really interesting to people, because it's not every day that you go on TDF and you see a Shakespeare Yiddish performance. So we knew, actually, I think, that people were going to be interested, but the question also was, how do we reach these people? Because I don't know a lot of Yiddish speakers, so we tried to go online and fill out like a lot of like forms on Jewish websites or New York City events, and we were posted on TDF, which I think also brought in some people. But yeah, it was definitely kind of a question of who was going to show up, and I know I think I focused so much on the show we were putting on that I didn't even really think so much about the impact of like it would have on the audience until we were there at our first performance, and we had someone in the audience who was a fluent Yiddish speaker, I think, who grew up speaking Yiddish. And I was just so touched, because I was thinking, like, when was the last time this person saw Yiddish being performed on stage in New York? So that was super special.
I
Nice.
think that also no.
No, Jake, go ahead.
I think also there is like an indie Yiddish theater community in New York City. You know, you talk to David Mandelbaum, you talk to all these guys who are also involved in this sort of thing, and word gets around. You know, people like to see new Yiddish material.
Right, right. And so Jenny gave at least, you know, part of an answer to my sort of follow-up question about audiences, audience responses. And, you know, so that's a really lovely sort of example of one noteworthy response. Jake, Hunter, or Jenny for that matter, other things come to mind about how people responded, either, you know, live, or you get sort of reactions in the audience that surprised you or moved you, or any other strong reaction to, and also just afterwards hearing from people, how do people respond to it?
I think it was really fun because the audience was very engaged. I think it was just exciting for people who knew Yiddish to hear Yiddish being said on stage. And I think I remember at our second performance at Hunter College, we were backstage, and immediately with our first piece, which was a scene from King Lear, we heard tremendous laughing from the audience. And we all looked at each other and we said, this is going to be a really fun audience. And it was interesting because in my Hamlet monologue, which is pretty dark to be or not to be, I found at certain moments that people were laughing because some of the Yiddish words being used, meshuggah, was funny, but to me, I was like, I'm really having this serious moment here. So it was kind of just, I think it was just, I realized it was just very exciting for people in the audience to see Yiddish on stage. And I think also, I think a lot of Jewish people in particular just felt very excited and connected to what we were doing.
Right, thank you. Should we, I know we've got lots of questions, some of which sort of overlap with other things I want to write. So I want to ask, excuse me. I'm happy to sort of open things up, and so Anne or Danielle, you want to come in and sort of give us some of
Yeah,
those questions?
sure. I've been tracking. These are incredible questions. I just want to, this is a great audience. And I don't know if you're all looking, I'm just grabbing the ones I've been tracking. If you've been noticing, but you're getting hundreds of hearts. I mean, we're all just having so much fun. This is such a wonderful topic for us. Um, One early question was, did early Yiddish performers do Shakespeare in drag? And I'm curious, you know, how gender diversity worked in the early days.
I love that question. And you know, if any of our young theater folks want to speak to kind of questions of gender, I'd love to hear from that too, in terms of how you deal with that. I mean, you've already talked, Jenny, about doing, you know, Hamlet yourself, right? And as we saw, right, I mean, that was done not only on the Yiddish stage. There's a long tradition of actresses playing, you know, of course we know the story that, you know, we don't actually have women performing on Shakespeare stages, you know, in Elizabethan times. We do have a tradition, of course, at that time of boys and young men playing the women's roles, and there's a later tradition of women playing some of the male roles that might have been seen as, you know, pardon the expression, more feminine, like Hamlet, right? And so Berta Kalish and Sarah Bernhardt and many others, but many other roles too. There's also sort of separately, there's a really interesting phenomenon of cross-dressing on the Yiddish stage that comes up in lots of different ways. And mention, one of my projects is the Digital Yiddish Theater Project, and we're quite interested in that. If you browse our blog, for example, there's Peppy Littman was a performer who performed a lot of male parts and basically kind of ballads and singing and things like that. Zachary Baker, the wonderful former YIVO and Stanford librarian, has an interesting piece about a show about an androgynous figure called Yoaman, I think if I remember right, Yoaman Nitaman. So the title itself is really fascinating. So, there are those kind of questions kicking around besides, the other questions, which is not so much about sort of cross-dressing or things like that, but just about, about gender roles in Jewish society, right? Which is very, very much a very live and active and big question in so much of the material in Yiddish and other languages as Jews are modernizing, and that tension between what tends to be a very patriarchal tradition and modernity are sort of coming up against each other. Then we have, one writer after another, men and women, who are, really fascinated with that question. But I want to sort of see if any three of you want to jump in and address that question of gender.
I would say that for us, it really didn't enter into the equation. Of course, we have women playing men's parts and women in trouser roles and women in, Vigdei Kodesh, but like it's not the thing of the thing. It's the same as how in Shakespeare time it wasn't thought of like, oh, this is such a thing that they're putting men in women's clothes. It was just, this is how theater is done right now, and this is how we're doing it.
I will also say the three of us were involved with a production of Hamlet at Hunter College. Like my last year, I was the assistant director, and Jake, you played Rosencrantz or Guildenstern, and Hunter played the clarinet. But anyway, we all were involved in this Hamlet production, and the main character of Hamlet was actually played by three females and one male, but it was kind of split into four parts. But to me, that really opened up my eyes to how amazing it was to see females play these really complex roles. Because personally, I feel like there has been so many male Hamlets that I've seen that it was just so interesting to see a female take on it. And it really, really opened my mind to like, yeah, why can't, like, Hamlet can and should be played by a woman, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Here, here. There is a question for the theater troupe. I think this is great, from Lindsay Bloom. In making the theater troupe, do you pull people from outside the college community? And with some of you graduating, is it functioning more like a school group, or maybe something that exists beyond and outside the school?
I would say it's definitely like, oh, no, no.
I was just gonna say that I feel like it started as kind of like a Hunter thing because like previously mentioned, we all did Hamlet together. We all did that horrible Holocaust play together. But I think since then it's kind of moved outside to like what I was mentioning before with like how we have like mutual friends who are like interested in theater and interested in Judaism and by extension like Yiddish and whatnot. So like I think it like kind of like started at Hunter and like it kind of just grew from there. Yeah. What were you gonna say, Jay?
There's a large population actually of Columbia Barnard students who, it was kind of like, I think for our live performance, it was like probably like 3 or 4 Barnard Columbia students and then a bunch of Hunter people. So it's now becoming infiltrated with all kinds of people, which is awesome.
So I have a question that came earlier that I thought was great. Weren't many of Shakespeare's plots seen as antithetical to Jewish values and halacha? They talk about some of them. And I also want to throw in Merchant of Venice. I mean, Shylock is such a controversial character. And when I think back to, to Eastern Europe, World War II, especially, it was such a stereotypical role. So maybe you can speak to both of those topics.
So, of course, like Shakespeare deals with things that are outside of halacha. Hamlet itself, oh, he's killing his brother. He's taking his brother's wife in a levirate marriage, which is like kind of chatzi, approved and not. But there's all this stuff. There's murder, there's this, there's that, and it's two things. It's important to remember that obviously these people did not live Api halacha, and this was the only thing that they were doing. And Yiddish Eastern Europe had the entire gamut of gangsters and murderers and all these people who were coming in and thieves and stuff like that. The thing that is like a tricky type situation is the constant references to Christian scripture that come through with Shakespeare's writing, because to be an educated person in Shakespeare's time is to have a background in this kind of scripture. There are a lot of allusions and things that are made to this sort of thing, and then that have to be adapted in order for us to deal with them. Like the King Lear scene that we were doing, the entire concept around how they were taking how King Lear's daughters were taking and Christian oaths and swearing. Yes, that's very true. And it's the same thing, which is obviously illegal or usher for, couldn't think of the English, for from Jews and for Jews of Eastern Europe at that time. But it's always been tackled in Yiddish theater, and we're tackling it in Yiddish theater now and in the modern time.
So I'll just ask you too. I see here Jeff Opera Addict has asked some really great questions. One is, do Yiddish translations tend to maintain the Shakespeare's iambic pentameter? I added the 10 because I'm assuming the translations run the gambit, but how do they work with the iambic pentameter?
They vary really widely. When I was sort of hunting down just any translations that I could find initially, and one thing I didn't say in the introduction is that in addition to the published texts, a number of which I mentioned specifically or showed, pictures of, there are dozens more Shakespeare translations and adaptations that can be found in archives like Evo's and particularly Evo's, but some other places too. So there were, many of these. I mean, theater people often aren't writing. It's more important, much of the time, at least for theater people. They want people to come see the plays, and they don't necessarily care about whether they're reading them or not. I mean, that was true for Shakespeare himself. And early on, when these playwrights just needed to sort of like, okay, Macbeth is giving me a plot I can work with. I just, there were kind of satirical pieces in the Yiddish press about how quickly these were being churned out. And they were often being churned out really fast. And there wasn't a sense of like, oh, we really need to capture this precious poetry. It's like, we need the plot of Macbeth, right? We need a good story on the stage. As the Yiddish theater matured, there came along people like Yud Goldberg, like Yud Schwartz, who's really known mostly as a poet rather than a playwright. Schwartz turns to Hamlet and Julius Caesar and writes very, very serious translations of them at a very high level, and is really working very hard to preserve meter and rhyme and things like that. So there's really there's a wide range.
I know we've been putting things up in the chat, but a couple of questions come up where people can watch Shakespeare plays like Hamlet in Yiddish. We're putting up links, correct? I'm just double checking. Maybe we'll put another link up, and I know we'll be sharing with everyone. There's one person asked if any of these Shakespeare plays in Yiddish were sung. And has that been happening with the troupe at all?
That's a great question. I mean, there is a very very robust tradition of Yiddish operetta and Yiddish opera. There's a certain amount of scholarship. There certainly needs to be more. There are recordings of some things. There Nothing comes to mind to me that's certainly not, you know, and obviously there's a long tradition of Shakespeare in opera generally, right? Of, you know, many of the great opera composers are turning to Shakespeare, and some people argue that some of the great Shakespearean operas are even better than the originals, and I won't necessarily get into that. But nothing comes to mind in terms of any of these plays that actually becomes a Yiddish opera. I mean, you could probably look at some of the plots and think, you know, there are elements of Shakespeare in them, but not so direct that, at least that I can think of.
I will say, sorry,
No, please go ahead.
we definitely have joked around in rehearsal about like, when are we doing these plays as musicals? Because I think when you say these words so much, it almost becomes like a rhythm. And like we've definitely, like I remember when we filmed our Hamlet scene with the second time. I remember one day we just all started singing some of Ophelia's lines together because we just heard them so much and they were so fun to say in Yiddish. So maybe one day.
The reason that they were so rhythmic is because Yosef Goldberg is more or less conservative of some aspects of the pentameter.
Makes sense. There's two questions. I'll ask the first one that really applies to everyone from the troupe. He says, are these wonderful Kinderlach themselves Yiddish speakers? If so, how did you learn?
So I deign to call myself a Yiddish speaker, but I suppose I'm a Yiddish speaker, but Makom Sheinish. And I learned through Yivo and the wonderful, wonderful Arbiter Ring.
Mazel tov. I'm thrilled, both ways.
I'm originally coming onto this project. I had no Yiddish, but currently I've taken Beginner 1 at Worker Circle, and I'm currently in Beginner 2, and I'm going to Yiddish Land. So hopefully we'll have more Yiddish soon.
Yeah, Yiddish Land in the summer is a retreat that we do. That's a 7-day retreat, and it's sold out with a waiting list right now. It's next month, but for everyone on the Zoom, there is a Winter in Yiddish Land that's virtual, and if you are interested in the summer retreat, get on to it right away. We usually announce around March. Jenny, were you going to tell us your Yiddish?
I am not a Yiddish speaker. I have some background in Hebrew, which I think helped me, but I think doing this project has helped me pick up a lot of Yiddish words, which has been really cool. And I am hoping to take a class soon when I'm not busy in rehearsal.
Yeah, and some people were asking in the chat, and there's always scholarships at the Workers Circle, and I know we have significant discounts for college students. So, and I won't speak to the others, but there are of course other virtual classes out there that you can check out. But I hope people, you know, I myself, you know, I'm a Workers Circle arbitering student, and it really is a lot of fun. So there's two things. One, Josh had asked, is the Hebrew Shakespeare scene quite robust, and does it come translated through Yiddish? Does that make sense to you, Joel?
Yeah, no, it absolutely makes sense. Sure. I mean, there's plenty of Shakespeare in Hebrew. Yeah, and again, you know, for all kinds of reasons. Partly because the Israeli theater also has roots in Russia, right? Habima, or I should say, also has roots in Eastern Europe, but in the case of Habima, right, in Russia, which gets imported to Palestine, you know, eventually. And so, you know, they're sort of looking around at some of the same influences. The Dybbuk is a sort of foundational text, obviously not Shakespeare, but you know, foundational text in both Hebrew and Yiddish. So there are lots of parallels there. I think that, I mean, I've read a little bit of scholarship on Shakespeare in Hebrew, and I think it tends to come more from either from English directly. I mean, certainly these days, if you were doing, you know, a new translation or a fairly recent translation of Shakespeare into Hebrew, it would probably be directly via English, given the presence of English in Israel. But going back some time, probably more likely from Russian than from Yiddish, I would think, and maybe to some extent from German also. But they're also good. There's, I mean, I remember it's been a while since I read it, but sort of a analysis of Julius Caesar, I think, in both Yiddish and Hebrew. And there is, there is some cross-pollination going on there as well.
I just want to say hello to Esther Goodman out there, who has been a longtime leader and member of the Workers' Circle and deeply engaged in Yiddishkeit. She has mentioned a few actors of Hasidic background who did Romeo and Juliet in Yiddish that were formerly from. She doesn't know if it was ever done live, but I wanted to ask you, do you have a number of formerly from people in your group, in your acting group?
Halavai. I would love to work with, Hasidim or anyone who has grown up speaking Yiddish in that way. But currently, no, not at the current moment.
And I thought it might be, now we really only have time for maybe a few last words. Although I will mention that someone asked if you wanted to sing some of the song you were talking about from Hamlet, just in case.
Oh, it was Ophelia's line when she said, "Haben a bessere Port zu sich," and then we turned it into like, "Haben a bessere Port zu sich, haben a bessere Port zu sich." That's all I'll give you. That's all I remember.
I want to thank all of you. It's been such an engaging, time has flown, and which is a sign of how much there is to still discuss, and I hope we'll keep talking. Any final words? And we'll, as I said, everyone's going to get an email with information and a link to this to this recording. Thank you all, and yes, and I'll be in Yiddish land too. I'll see some of you there. And Joel, any last any comments? Anything you want to share with, and are there any? Is there any schedule of Shakespeare programs coming up for you all?
I'll leave that to the others to say. I'll just say what a pleasure it's been again to be back with even virtually with the Arbeiter Ring, to see you, Anne, and to talk to all of you in this forum. It's really been a pleasure. As I said, it's very exciting to see young folks coming to this material, and I'll be very interested to see what you do next, and maybe if you're able to share anything about that. I know that everyone would love to hear that.
Yes. Is there anything, Jake, Hunter, or Jenny, you want to share with in as a final note?
Yeah, we're still kind of figuring out our next project, but I would suggest looking us up either on Instagram. We have a very easy name to remember, the Yiddish Shakespeare Project. We're on Instagram, YouTube. You can email us at the Yiddish Shakespeare Project. If you email us, we can kind of keep you on our list. I think Instagram is a great way to follow us. We post like audition stuff, any updates. So yeah, just keep your eyes out.
Perfect. And everyone will get in the email a connection to the project. So we'll make sure everyone's in touch. And thank you all. Thank you everyone for joining us. This has been a wonderful audience, a wonderful presentation, exactly what we need in the world right now. We put some joy in the world, which is a positive. So thank you all. Ashenim Dank, and see you next time. Be well.
Schönen Dank, seid gesund.